Hello and welcome to today's meeting of Democrats of Greater Tucson. My name is Larry Bodine, and I'm the president of Democrats of Greater Tucson. And I will be your host today. And as you can see, our guest is Dr. Dwight Moore, a PhD from the Arizona End of Life Options. Dwight, how are you doing today?
Thank you very much.
I do have a few quick announcements. And one is ballots are going to be sent out on October 7th, and that'll be here sooner than you think. And when you get your ballot, vote it immediately. You don't need to put on first-class postage. It's already got first-class postage. Or you can drop it off at a ballot drop-off page by checking with the recorder site. Secondly, the campaign is underway now for real. There are less than 9 weeks left before the election. You know, we all know the result that we're looking for. I want to all encourage you emphatically to find a candidate that you like and go to work for him or her. Call your legislative district and they will give you an assignment to do volunteer work. There's all kinds of things that you can do now. If you don't know what your legislative district is, just email me and I'll look you up and I will tell you and put you in touch with the right people. And then finally, I just want to encourage you to check the Democrats of Greater Tucson website. I'm going to do a quickie little screen share again. Oh, you can always go to thedgt.org and you will find, there won't be a meeting next Monday because that's Labor Day, and I hope everybody is out there celebrating with our brothers and sisters in the labor movement. You know, if it weren't for labor, the whole notion of a weekend wouldn't exist. We have unions to thank for that. There's like some fabulous articles. If you need a good laugh, read this article here, To Laugh Right Now. Articles about how voters everywhere are prioritizing Social Security, and then a kind of scary article about the connection between Arizona GOP legislators and right-wing militias. You know, we have right-wing militias right here in Tucson too. It's my absolute delight to introduce Dr. Dwight Moore, PhD. He is the chair of the Education Committee of Arizona End of Life Options. Arizona End of Life Options is a nonprofit, and it is working to pass legislation right here in Arizona for eligible patients to die with dignity. Dr. Moore will review the 6 choices that we all have at the end of life. Little background on him: he is a psychologist and he volunteers, as I mentioned, for Arizona End of Life Options. He was a team leader in California during their campaign to pass medical aid in dying. And he's also a volunteer for the End of Life Washington. He is now retired and he helps select and develop leaders worth following. So Dr. Moore, tell us a story about having a dignified death and medical aid in dying.
Thank you very much. And to all of you, appreciate you joining this webinar today. This is a tough topic, and there's a strength of character that I think that's reflected on your part of being willing to wade into the idea of death and dying. As most of us know, it's one of those topics that puts a bit of a dampener on conversation. So thank you for doing that. I'm going to tell a story of a real death, in this case, a good death that I participated in the state of Washington. And then I'll use a slideshow presentation to talk about 6 choices we have at the end of life, as well as some detail about the medical aid in dying. This is a law that 9 states have in the District of Columbia that we do not yet have here in Arizona, but our organization is trying to get this passed. So let me start with the story. I'm a rain bird, so I spend some time up in Washington State. We have, as volunteers, we help patients navigate the law, and we got a call one day in our Seattle office from a husband of a patient who wanted to consult with a volunteer. So I was closest, got the call, went out to the house. And as I approached the house, the husband came outside of the door, shut the door behind him, and stood in front of me as a barrier. And he said, "I want you to know something. I don't support this." So being a psychologist, we have sort of simple lines. It's tell me more. Let me understand why. And he talked for some time about his religious objections to medical aid in dying. He talked about how he thought it was inappropriate for his wife. And I listened until I think he felt understood enough to allow me to come into the house. So I got his point of view very quickly. He took me to the house and said, I guess time to meet my wife. So we went into one of the back rooms. And the picture I saw then is, think of an ALS patient who is in advanced stages and musculature is all very, Stephen Hawking is a picture that you may have in your mind. She was hunched over a computer program in a wheelchair with all of her muscles like this, her neck bent, unable to speak without the aid of the computer. She was beautifully articulate. She, with one finger, would type out what she wanted to say to me, so our conversations took a while. But she was clear that she wanted to use the medical aid in dying law because she didn't want to continue to live her life in the increasing horror of what ALS does to a body. So I talked to her about options and choices. She said, you know, my husband doesn't agree with this, and I recognize that, but I was clear with her that this was her choice. The law is, asks in the sense that you include others, but it's not their decision. One of the steps that there are two physicians who involved themselves in this process. One of those physicians was not sure that she was going to be able to self-medicate. One of the requirements is that you're either able to swallow, which she was not able to do, or be able to push the syringe into her feeding tube. Like many ALS patients, she had a feeding tube coming out of her stomach, and the task was to actually fill that feeding tube. So I asked the doctor if I could do a trial run with her and see if she had the capacity. And he agreed that if she passed the trial, then she would be eligible for the law. So we loaded one of the syringes, a basic plunger, as you would expect. We loaded that up with her dinner, which is obviously a soluble. And she put both of her hands like this on top of the syringe and depressed it with the weight of her whole upper body and was able to feed herself. The doctor was impressed by that and so agreed to go ahead with his writing the prescription. So one of the tasks that she had in front of her then was to set a time. And that's an odd, if you think about it, it's a really odd occurrence, is to say, well, okay, yeah, Saturday morning at 9 is when I want to die. She had a sense of urgency about this. So she set a couple of days in advance, got her daughters out from where they were, had enough time to travel. And then after that, first couple of visits, I spent some more time with the husband to see where he was on this, and he was still very reluctant to do this or to support this. That obviously caused tension between the two of them. On the day of her death, I arrived just prior to the taking the medication. We give anti-nausea meds, which she ingested again through her feeding tube. It helps people from throwing up. And then about an hour later, we filled the syringe with the compound. It's about 1/4 of a cup of mixture. I'll tell you more about what's in it in a little later on. And sitting up in her bed with her daughters holding her hands. And then an amazing thing happened. Her husband, who had been sitting in the living room, came into the bedroom and sat with her and their daughters on the bed. And she once again took the filled syringe, and this even looked like, 2 days after we'd seen the trial, even more of a Herculean effort, pushed this medication into her body and lay back. And within, I think, 3 minutes, she was in a deep sleep. And she set the record for the quickness to death. She actually died in about 8 minutes. She was exceptionally fragile. But there's a peace and a harmony and a quietness and a determination to these deaths. And that's why I label it a good death as opposed to a bad death. And her family was with her. So that's the story I wanted to tell you, because the opposite of that some of you probably have had experience where folks have not had relief or palliative care, and the death is very bad toward the last weeks and months. So what I want to do is I'm going to pull up a slideshow and walk through it with you about 6 ways that we have to die, and then some more detail about medical aid in dying. So my hope is that this is visible to all of you. Your life, your death, your choice. The presentation I'm going to do at this point, about 15 minutes or so, we'll talk a little bit about those 6 options. I'll give you some information about the state of Washington in terms of medical aid in dying, what the criteria is for that choice. I'll present a couple moral dilemmas that we found. I've been in attendance to over 50 deaths in Washington State. So I have some experience about what the family struggles with and asks about and has concern about. I'll give you some resources, and then we'll have time. Larry will conduct a question and answer for us. I want you to take a minute just on your own, and if you want to close your eyes, that's great. If you don't, that's up to you. I want you to do what psychologists call a guided fantasy. I want you to project yourself forward to the last hour of your life. And I know this is an odd request, but go ahead, get yourself in the place where you will be in that last hour, and notice where you are, who's there with you, what are the sounds you hear, what are some of the smells you hear or smell, how do you feel? Take a moment to just get a sense of that last set of moments. Let's talk about this a little bit. Here's what people say other than you, but my guess is there'll be some parallels to that last hour you imagined. Most people say that they want to be at home. My guess is that probably most of you saw yourself at home. You did not see yourself in a hospital hooked up to a respirator, to blood oxygen, with a heart monitor going beep, beep, beep in the background, waiting for you to flatline. You didn't see any of that. You weren't hooked up with tubes. You were at maybe in your favorite easy chair in your bed, and you were surrounded by the people who love you. Your pain and your in discomfort are managed. You have whatever spiritual needs respected. Sometimes that takes the form of somebody's playing a harp, they're reading favorite gospel, singing gospel music, or reading the Bible. Whatever those spiritual needs are, they're respected and individual, and that you understand that you're not a devastating burden on the people around you. That's how most people want to end their lives. Sometimes, even if I stand in the middle of the room, no one acknowledges me. So this is the proverbial elephant in the room. This is what death is about. My wife and I would have dinner parties when we were in Washington, and we would talk to our guests about death and dying. And of course, we were just doom and gloom, and it would put a bit of a dampener on some of those dinner parties. We don't go there very often. It's tough to think about talking to our kids about this. The conversations tend to be a bit truncated and short. So what we're doing at Arizona End of Life Options is we're getting people to talk about this, to imagine themselves, to think through the choices that they have. Jennifer Glass was a Californian who helped with the campaign back in 2015. She said, "I'm doing everything I can to extend my life, but no one has the right to prolong my death." She died badly prior to the law in California being passed. So here are the 6 end-of-life options that Larry mentioned at the top. Let me go through these in a bit of detail. My hope is that my pace, my language is fitting for you and that it's understandable. So the first choice we have is to do all treatment interventions. Every course of chemotherapy that we can, radiation, infusion drugs, treatments that come out of other countries, Mexico and so on and so forth, that purport to be able to solve the problem, the illness. That is the right of the patient to do all possible treatment interventions. The second choice was the opposite of the first, which is to say, as a patient, I'm done. I'm discontinuing, I'm refusing medical treatment. And you may have a clinical trial that you want me to do. You may have a newest set of chemotherapy drugs, but find somebody else to use those on, because it's not me. I'm going to let my terminal illness take my life. The third is hospice, and my guess is at least half of you have some sort of experience with hospice. My hope is that it was positive. Hospice is not in the business of killing its patients, it's in the business of keeping them comfortable. And they're brilliant at it, from providing equipment, hospital beds, clergy, social workers, nurses about bed sores and medication for pain and anxiety. Their job is to keep their patients comfortable until a natural disease state takes their lives. The next one is palliative care and palliative sedation. You're probably familiar with this in a couple of ways. Palliative care is basically keeping people comfortable. So even if you take an ibuprofen because your back has been spasming, that's palliative care. We don't want people to be in discomfort. So your doctor may prescribe for your illness along the way a number of medications or treatments that keep you as comfortable as you can be. Palliative sedation is slightly different in that it's usually hospital-based or institutional-based. The patient is actually in an institution. There's a family consult with a group of physicians that basically says, look, Uncle George is dying, and he'll probably die within the next 2 or 3 days. And we really don't want him to be in the kind of discomfort he is. We no longer have the medication that can keep him comfortable. So what happens is they sedate the patient to the point of what's called coma. They're no longer aware, and then the natural disease state takes over. One of the team members of Arizona End of Life Options is Dr. Tom Fitch, who was a palliative sedation and oncology expert at Mayo Clinic here until 2 years ago when he retired. Excellent resource. The fifth choice is voluntary stopping eating and drinking. This is the choice that my father made. At 94, all of his systems shut down. They call it failure to thrive. And basically, he was very clear with everybody around him and said, look, when I get to the point where I'm so confined, I'm going to stop eating and drinking because my life is done, and I don't want all the interventions. I don't want antibiotics. I don't, so on and so forth. So he called me up and he said, you got to come out here. You got to be my coach because this is going to be not a very easy thing to do. And he's right about that. This is a tough choice to make. The first couple of days are quite uncomfortable, even though there are salves and things like massage and cold press compresses that keep people as comfortable as possible. The first 2 or 3 days is very uncomfortable. And then the patient moves into kind of a semi-sleep coma process for the next 2 or 3 days. And then sometime within the 7th to 12th day, the body dies. Voluntary stopping eating and drinking. And then the sixth choice is medical aid in dying, and I'm going to give you a little more detail about that. So if you have questions about the distinctions of these 6 choices at the end here, please ask them, and I can see if I can sort it out. The 9 states in the District of Columbia basically have similar statistics at this point because everybody's sort of new at this, relatively speaking. Oregon is the oldest state at 20 plus years. On average, about 140 people actually use the medication. We get about 900 to 1,000 calls a year of people who think they're eligible. Actually, about half of them, about 500 to 600, are eligible and then go ahead and get the medication, but for various reasons, they decide not to use it. There's a great comfort in knowing that in your medicine cabinet, you have a medication in which you can plan your death. Average time to death, a little more than an hour. Most folks had cancer. We encourage enrollment in hospice because of all the reasons I said earlier. Primary reason people choose aid in dying was the loss of autonomy and the loss of dignity. And during all of the years that this has been in place in the different 9 states, there's been not one incident of abuse. You've got 6 months, but with aggressive treatment, we can help make that seem much longer. So this is my nightmare. I don't want to be this guy on the gurney getting more advice about how I can prolong my life, my bad life. Here's the formal definition of death with dignity. Take a read of this. Pay attention to the red, because those are the legal requirements. When a patient is trying to determine if they're eligible for the law, there's a timeline that they have to follow. The first request is a phone call to a doctor that says, I would like to use end-of-life option. Please put that in my medical chart. That's the first request. That begins a 17-day clock. During the next 15, 16 days, your case is reviewed by 2 physicians, both of whom have to determine, do you have a terminal illness and are you able to self-administer the medication? And are you of sound mind? Can you make medically sound decisions? If they believe that those are met, those criteria, then 15 days later you do a second request, as well as a written request that are signed by 2 people attesting to your mental ability to make decisions. Then there's a 2-day waiting period where the physician has to wait in order for the prescription to be written for the medication. That prescription goes to a pharmacy, like any prescription, gets filled, and the family or a volunteer picks that up. The reason for this 17-day timeline is to avoid impulsive decisions. It's not like going into your doctor's office saying, Doc, I've got a bacterial infection, write me a script for antibiotics, and she does it, and you get it that afternoon. So there's a kind of a wait period built into the law. It has to be voluntary in terms of requirements. As you know, you have to self-administer. 2 physicians have to determine mental capacity. I'm a PhD psychologist licensed in the state of Washington. So if one of the doctors isn't sure whether the patient has mental acuity, then they refer that case to myself or a psychiatrist to do an assessment about their ability to make medical decisions. This assessment is a relatively easy thing to do because what we do is we start at a simple level. What day is it? Where are you? Who's the President of the United States? And if people are not able to answer questions at that level, then they're deemed to be not appropriately capable. If, of course, they're able to easily answer those questions, plus things like, do you understand what the medication will do when you ingest it, then we determine their capacity. People wonder about depression here. The clinical depression that incapacitates somebody to make decisions would mean that the patient's not eligible for the law. Depression, which is normal sadness of death and dying, leaving the things you love, the people you love, the hobbies you love, is not considered an inability to make medical decisions. And then the doc talks to the patient to confirm the request and make sure that they're not getting coerced from somewhere. So as I said about the story I told, we give anti-nausea medications prior, about an hour prior. And then the medication itself is now a compound of morphine, propranolol, Valium, and digoxin. One of our doctors said this is enough to kill a blue whale. It's actually only about 1/4 cup of liquid mixed either by a volunteer or a family member. and swallowed through a straw or through a feeding tube. Time to death is a great range of the time to death, but basically it's a little more than an hour. There's a bitter taste to this medication, so people are encouraged to have a chaser of their choice. The leading contender right now in Washington is vodka. Other wills and provisions. Wills, contracts, insurance, and annuities are not affected by choosing aid in dying. What appears on your death certificate is the terminal illness, not medical aid in dying. So pancreatic cancer, lung cancer, that's what appears, and it does not affect your wills at all. And then the other important piece I want to emphasize here is medical aid in dying is not considered suicide or assisted suicide. Here in the state of Washington, our friends at CAP want to label this as physician-assisted suicide. That's inaccurate for the following reasons. Take a read at this list. Left column is what medical aid in dying is about. Right column is suicide. You'll see the differences. I want to tell a brief story about this. During my PhD training, we did different internships. One of mine was as on a suicide hotline. I was lucky enough for 3 months to get the night shift. So I've been successful and sometimes not successful in talking people off the ledge. The mental state of a suicidal patient is 180 degrees opposed, diametrically opposed to the mental state of the patients I've worked with who are using the medical aid in dying. Emotionally, the medical aid in dying person is calm, they're relaxed, there's a sense of closure for them. There's been plenty of time to say goodbyes to their families. And there's a calmness that's sort of odd, but it's quite real. On the other end of the continuum is suicidal ideation and emotion is chaotic. It's asyndetic, it's wild, it's angry, it's rageful, it's blue depression, and erratic behavior, quick jerk movements. So there's just no comparison here of these two, and I wanted to emphasize that for you. Thanks. So here's things you can do if you want to help us get this law passed here in the state. We have a goal to pass the medical aid in dying by 2022. Here's a fun thing to do. I just did this 2 days ago with my family physician, is talk to your doctor. Each of us has 3 or 4 probably doctors, dermatologist, oncologist, maybe cardiologist, pulmonologist, and then your family physician, obviously. Let them know that you support death with dignity. Ask them if they know what the law is. My doctor, at my appointment 2 days ago, happened to have a medical student he was teaching in the consult with me, all remote, of course. I asked him about this. Neither of them had ever heard of the law, but to their credit, they were curious when I explained it, and they agreed that they would think about it. So it was an interesting conversation. You may get a range of responses when you do this. We're trying to expand the sensibility of our physicians about the choice. Call your senator and legislator and let them know about your support. We have a 7 Touches campaign where for the last 6 months, we've been calling and emailing our legislature to let them know about this. You can hold a virtual house party. I can do a webinar like this for a group of your friends, share information that way. And then I'll give you our website in a second. If you want to join our projects, we have a number that require talent and passion. So that would be great too. Among the 600 things else that you have to do in your life. Here are the moral dilemmas I talked about. Take a look at these because this may pluck some of your thoughts. So here's the resources that I promised, the website itself is azendoflifeoptions.org. That's got all kinds of information on it. If you have more of a private question you'd like to ask me about, there's my phone number. Feel free to call me. And again, the website itself has much more than we can possibly cover in the time we have today. So that's the end of this. I'm going to close this. Larry is going to ask various ways, his magic. If you have questions, and I'll attempt to answer them.
Dr. Moore, thank you very much for a really powerful presentation. It calls to mind a Buddhist prayer that I have on my bulletin board, and it says, "May all beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering." And it sounds to me that's exactly what medical aid in dying is. First question is from Steve and Christina Early. They would like to know, how can we participate in Arizona end-of-life options?
Yeah, there are lots of specific ways. We need information technology experts. We need volunteers to call radio stations across the state and get us interviewed on radio stations. There's probably 10 or 15 projects right now that need smart, motivated volunteers. The way to do this is just go on our website, azendoflifeoptions.org, and there's a button to click, I want to volunteer. That will get you to us and get you a mentor, and we'll talk to you about what your skills and interests are and figure out a best fit.
Another question about, what happens if you have dementia or Alzheimer's? Does that defeat the process?
Yeah, this is a sad part of the story. In the United States, if you have diagnosed dementia, you're not deemed to be eligible for death with dignity. And that's because folks don't believe you have the mental capacity to make medical decisions. This is a very sad situation because we've been trying to figure out a way to what we call pay it forward, where you can write your intentions. If I get to stage 2 or stage 3 dementia, somebody can give me the cocktail. That's just simply not legal in the United States. In Belgium, Canada, Switzerland, that is legal, given certain parameters. But right now we're hamstrung by that reality. One of the things, just to be clear, and I think probably your listeners all know this, but it's really important to have a very good advanced directive in place, also known as a living will, where you actually clarify for your physicians exactly what you want to have happen and not in terms of medical intervention. And that can extend in the advanced directive can extend into Alzheimer's. So you can actually build into your directives that you were not fed at a certain point, and that's the closest we can get to trying to manage the issue of not being eligible from a medical aid in dying standpoint.
A quick question of my own, and it concerns how the law applies to life insurance payouts upon death. Does the proposed state law override the contract provisions of the life insurance policy so that if you self-administer this medication, that it's not suicide?
Right. So yeah, it's very clear that the cause of death is the underlying terminal illness, not medical aid in dying. And that's written into every one of these laws. So it's very clear that your life insurance company could not withhold payment. Usually when somebody gets life or health insurance, long-term care insurance, there's a 2-year stipulation that if you commit suicide within that window, the years vary, but then you're not going to get payout, so that people don't intentionally buy insurance and then kill themselves. With medical aid in dying, you're in a totally different ballpark, so you're not going to get penalized for your life insurance policy.
All right. Lynn Ratner has a question. She says, I believe some countries allow physician-assisted dying in cases of profound and pervasive mental illness, where years of attempted treatment has not alleviated the problem. Isn't mental suffering the same as physical suffering?
Well, you're asking a psychologist to respond about this. I could go on for about 3 days on it. I'm not going to do that. She's absolutely right. Dignitas in Switzerland, Belgium, Canada, all consider mental health related disease states as eligible criteria for death with dignity. There does have to be pretty clear documentation. You can't just walk in and say, you know, I've been really sad for the last day or two, doc, I want to die. That won't work. But they understand that there are some clinical depression, for example, is a biochemical reality. That's not a mood state. So the biochemical reality is as real as pancreatic cancer or lung cancer. And that's why they consider it.
We have a question from Steve and Christina Early. They ask, what happens if the family will not agree with the decision of the patient to die with medical aid?
Yeah, Steve and Christina are pretty astute. In most situations, there's the family member who appears who doesn't agree. It's this odd thing that, and usually that person has been estranged for a number of years. So our advice here is as early as possible, like even before people get terminal illnesses, begin the conversation about what do you hope for at the end of your life? Which of the 6 choices would you like to do, or a cascading number of them? So, and include your kids in those conversations so that people have a real good idea for years ahead of time where you're coming from. Last minute conversations about this are very tough and usually cause the kind of consternation that is being asked about. So long-term conversations, the bottom line on this is it is the patient's decision only whether to use this law. Nobody else gets to weigh in, like the husband I told about in the story. We, of course, want to pay attention to those folks. They're important in lives. They need to feel understood and validated. But in a bottom line sense, if nobody else agrees, or if somebody else, they're no longer part of the decision. And there have been a couple of situations where the patient actually had to draw the line and say, look, if you support this, you can come and be with me at my death. If you don't, I don't want you to appear. And that's a tough line to draw in the sand.
Bridget Rissessi, I'm sorry I butchered the name. She had a question about one of the slides that you showed that listed in red the requirements. For example, terminally ill and mentally capable. Was there an additional requirement?
Be able to self-ingest. So you have to be able to either swallow or inject in your feeding tube this medication. And the reason for that is that euthanasia is done by somebody else to you. These laws are not about euthanasia. This is a planned death, and you self-administer as a requirement.
Okay, my friend Carolyn asks, what if you don't have a terminal medical illness and you just want to choose death earlier than normal? What are your options?
Yeah, good question. The obvious answer is stopping eating and drinking voluntarily. There are a number of other choices. One is called the final exit. There's a book written on that. We have an organization in the state that will help walk people through that. So that's the reference I would give for that, the final exit. That's another way of dying before terminal illness will take you. Voluntary eating and drinking. And then of course, the number of suicidal choices, but I'm not going to talk about those or advocate those because that's not part of what we support.
We have a question from Susie Anderson. She asks, if a patient is found to be in the early stages of dementia, can you request to have death with dignity at a later time, even years later?
Good question, Susie. You cannot. Of course, you can request it, but it won't be fulfilled because it's not legal. If a patient is in the early stages of Alzheimer's, stage 1 or 2, they can be eligible for the law because they have windows of lucidity. There can be times, for example, where they're very clear and that they qualify for the law. And if they kind of catch it early enough in the progress of dementia or Alzheimer's, then they are eligible for the law. But as those stages progress, the frequency of lucidity, clarity decreases dramatically.
Question about what special problems arise if you're the only person left in your family? In other words, you have no spouse, no children. What special problems arise?
Wow, that's a tough one. The good news is that most of the 9 states in the District of Columbia have some version of the volunteers that I described in Washington. And the volunteers will help the patient make this happen. So just a quick story about this, Larry, if you don't mind. We had a person like that who was on Medicaid, indigent, no money of his own, in a long-term care facility. And he wanted to qualify for the law. He was not allowed by the long-term care facility to take the medication on their premises. So I went with another volunteer and we rented a hotel room, extravagant $80 a night hotel room, got him in his wheelchair and transported him to the hotel room. And the hospice nurse agreed to be present. We got him his medication and he took the medication by himself in the hotel room with the hospice nurse present because she was able to declare the death. And then I contacted the front desk to say that a guest had died in their hotel. And we were able then to make the transport to the crematorium. So usually these states are equipped to help you in that way so that you've got some aid in that process.
Another question from Carolyn, and she asks, how long do you have to live in the state of Washington, where this law has been enacted, to declare residency? And is there a state that's closer to Arizona?
Yeah, Colorado, California are both closer. Residency to get residency, you have to go to, there are 2 or 3 methods. You can have a lease, which you can do in the first day that you're there. If you have a lease or you purchase a place, or if you stay in with your kids, for example, or friends, they can lease you a room in their house and you are automatically considered a resident. You can go to the DMV and transfer your Arizona driver's license for a Colorado license and you're a citizen. Or you can go get your voter registration. Sometimes that takes a little longer because you have to usually have some sort of driver's license or backup. So establishing residency is relatively easy. What's more difficult in switching states is finding 2 physicians who are willing to attest to your terminal illness, because you need to transfer your records and then somehow in the system find those 2 doctors in the city that you're living. And again, the volunteer groups in those states can help you do that. There was the famous case, Larry, that people may remember, 2015, of a young woman named Brittany Menard who had glioblastoma, which is brain cancer. She moved from California, which did not have the law, to Oregon, and she died with dignity there. She, by the way, was a poster child for the campaign in California to get this done, and really made, in her death, made a great contribution to passing that legislation.
Program Director Sandy Binion has a question, and that is, has a court ever overridden the patient's decision?
Never. There are contested court cases that you may remember out of Florida and places like that, but that was more turf battle over who had medical power of attorney over patients who were in comas. So it did not have to do with medical aid in dying.
Okay, Steve and Christina would like to know, how close is this to becoming law in Arizona? You know, we have the evil trifecta in Arizona where the governor and both houses of the legislature are in Republican hands.
So I'm an inveterate optimist. the 36 Democrats on this call, plus a lot of us, the others of us in the state, are working really hard to flip those 2 or 3 seats in the House and Senate. So first step, obviously, is to get the majority back so that we can have committee chairs who are willing to hear this bill. We're going to drop the bill again in January. And our hope is that we will have committees that will, hopefully Health and Welfare Committee, who will entertain the bill. Then we have the obstacle of the CAP and Kathy Herod, and the obstacle of the governor. So, the governor's around another 2 years. So if we can't make it this year because, let's say we get it passed in the Senate and House, but the governor vetoes it, then we get to come back a year later. So how close are we? When I talk to people, we have the half full glasses and we have the half empty glasses. I know we're not going to have the bill if we do nothing. I know that if I sit here, be sequestered and retired and do nothing, we're not going to get this bill. If I and our other volunteers and some of you who are interested in volunteering do something, then the probability is increased, not guaranteed.
All right, another question from Bridget, and she says, based on your recent story of a single person, is it correct that some long-term care facilities will allow medical aid in dying and some long-term care facilities will not?
That's exactly correct. And each of the policies vary. Interestingly, it really comes down to the lease agreement about who actually, quote, owns the space that the guest, the resident, is renting. Those people who believe that the guest really kind of, quote, owns their own space usually allow them to do what they want in their own apartment. Those who believe that it's an institution and that you're there just temporarily sometimes do not allow it. There's also what I would call a don't ask, don't tell policy, that if, as a volunteer, for example, I don't inquire about this, or if nobody raises the issue, then a resident of a long-term care facility can quietly take the medication one evening when I'm visiting and their daughters are visiting or sons are visiting, and they die. And those facilities are quite used to having people die in their institutions. We've never had a lawsuit. We've never been questioned about it to the extent where somebody was upset about it. We try to be as open with our communication with the administration of those facilities because we want them to support it also.
We have a question from Alice Hutchison, who asks, could you explain the difference between euthanasia on one hand and medical aid in dying on the other hand?
Yeah, euthanasia is when somebody else injects you with medication that takes your life. Medical aid in dying is self-administered. There's not a third party, an outside party involved. We euthanize our pets. Medical aid in dying is self-administered. It's a big difference. Jack Kevorkian euthanized his patients. We do not do that in medical aid in dying.
Another question about states where medical aid in dying has been enacted. In those states, is there a list of available doctors who agree with the practice?
No, this is a sad state of affairs. Physicians are worried that they're going to get labeled. So those lists exist on the part of volunteers, but they're not distributed and they're closely held. So that if I moved to California, for example, and I got connected to the coalition in California, the End of Life Coalition, they would help me find doctors. But they're not going to send a list to me for me to call those physicians.
Susie asks the question, does having an existing MPA preclude a patient's ability to get the right to die with dignity?
Does having a medical power of attorney preclude the ability to get medical aid in dying? Unless your medical power of attorney said, in no case will I use medical aid in dying, which is highly unlikely, your medical power of attorney, so somebody else is your medical power of attorney and you have an agreement with them, they would need to be clear that you choose medical aid in dying. If the medical power of attorney believes that you should not or cannot cannot use the law, then you've got a problem. Then I would clear that up. I'd get another medical power of attorney.
Yeah, you really need to pick someone to be your medical power of attorney who agrees with your viewpoints. And
Absolutely.
I think that'll clear a lot of things up.
Okay.
Question from Bridget. She's curious about what argument do Republicans put forward when they object to medical aid in dying, and when their philosophy is not to intrude the life of individuals.
Yeah, that's a great question. If she wants to find the full answer on the CAP, Center for Arizona Policy website, there are 5 objections to medical aid in dying. If she wants to claw through those, their basic objectives are that it erodes the sanctity and the dignity of the medical profession, that it leads to greater suicidal rates, that there's a slippery slope that pretty soon we're going to be euthanizing disabled people, the elderly, folks that we don't really want around. Those are 3 of the arguments they have against this law. The fundamental philosophy behind their objection is the issue of choice that shows up with the birth control and pro-life, pro-choice controversy. It's who actually has the say here in your body, your life, your death. That's the underlying philosophic difference that they bring to the table.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Moore. That exhausts all of our questions. You've been extremely informative and extremely helpful. And I wonder if you could sum up by telling us how we can support your efforts and what legislators we should assist in getting this law passed in Arizona.
Yeah, thank you. So medical aid in dying is a choice at the end of life. We're trying to get the law passed here in Arizona. To find out how to volunteer, go to www.azendoflifeoptions.org. And there's a button there to volunteer or learn more about the law itself. We do not have a Republican sponsor for the bill that we're going to drop in January. Life would be lovely if your folks knew of a Republican sponsor or at least a co-sponsor who would help us on this. We have 2 Democratic sponsors, but we would love to have the moderate Republican weigh in with us. So if you have any knowledge or information, let us know about that. That's of particular importance.
All right, well, Dr. Moore, thanks so much for coming to Democrats of Greater Tucson. And with that, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I look forward to seeing you again, and I'm going to end the meeting now. So long, Dr. Moore.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.